The American Congressional Exchange is a program that we have that BPC started where we bring two members together, a Republican and a Democrat from two very different parts of the country, and we have them visit each individual's districts and really get to know not only that member, but also that district.
Now, up until that trip, I did not know David Trone. And because of his willingness to make the trip, to come out, to spend that time with me, I can testify that I now have a friend and an ally on many issues of mutual concern.
Many of us share the same principles, and we bring to the table different life experiences, different political perspectives. We shouldn't find that dangerous or divisive. We should find it something to celebrate.
This is how America works, is by coming together, rolling up our sleeves, getting away from the partisanship, getting away from the rhetoric, and getting back to just delivering.
When you have a conversation with people and you laugh and you get to know them, you no longer see them in the same light, and you're much more willing to say, let's figure out how we can be friends and really find solutions. It creates a different type of dialogue and friendship that exists, and it also allows those members to see how different parts of the country are and how many similarities there are.
Good morning, and thank you to everyone for joining us on a Monday morning. Hopefully this is a great way to start your week, talking through some interesting policy options. So I'm Michelle Nellenbach. I'm the Vice President for Strategic Initiatives here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and I am thrilled to kick off this series we're going to have, speaking with conservative thought leaders about how to advance a conservative agenda in a divided government. Obviously, Republicans only control the House, leaving the Democrats with both the Senate and the White House, which makes it a little bit of a challenge to put their imprint on policy. We've seen the Democrats push on their priorities, including things like paid leave, childcare, worker benefits, et cetera. And those are issues that typically, at least when I was up on the Hill some 15 years ago, Republicans would talk about more, not as if something the federal government should address, but perhaps incentivize to the private sector. But as we've noticed, there is now a populist branch of the Republican Party on the rise, and they're speaking more to workers and they're speaking more to families. And so it'll be interesting to see how Republicans engage on these topics. So to dive a little bit further into that, on how Republicans can advance a pro-family agenda, I am honored to be joined by Patrick Brown, who is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where his work focuses on developing a robust pro-family economic agenda and supporting families as the cornerstone of a healthy and flourishing society. Prior to joining EPPC, Patrick served as a senior policy advisor to Congress's Joint Economic Committee. There, he helped lead research about how to make it more affordable to raise a family and more effectively invest in the youth and young adults. He also previously worked as a government relations staffer for the Catholic Charities of the USA. And then our other panelist is Ted McCann, who is a BPC fellow, but also is with the American Idea Foundation. He was previously assistant to the Speaker for Policy, managing welfare, education, workforce, pension, telecom, and Social Security issues for Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. Prior to that, he was staff director for the Social Security Subcommittee of the House Ways and Means Committee under Speaker Ryan's chairmanship. In that capacity, he negotiated and drafted the Social Security Benefit Protection and Opportunity Enhancement Act of 2015 as part of the Bipartisan Budget Act. So welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. Before I dive into the questions, though, I do want to let our audience know that you can do questions in the chat or post them on Twitter at BPC_live. So good morning to you both. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Ted, I want to start with you. Tell us about the work you're doing with former Speaker Ryan at the American Idea Foundation that advocates for evidence-based free market solutions to persistent poverty.
Yeah, what we're trying to do is identify programs at the local level that are either trying to develop evidence or have developed evidence in order to scale those programs up. The idea, I think, came about based on a number of pieces of legislation that the former speaker passed while he was in Congress. We passed bills such as Families First Act, which was a child welfare reform bill. We passed bills such as criminal justice reform, the First Step Act. And all of these bills really came about in large part because a significant amount of evidence was developed at the state level, and we were able to bring that evidence back up to the federal level and help people learn from it and then sort of implement that at the federal level. And so what we're trying to do is identify those programs that are sort of, from a center-right perspective, reducing poverty or improving upward mobility. They're trying to do it in an evidence-based way, and either need help developing that evidence or they need help in scaling. And so that's sort of what we're working on. We think it's really, really important. I think from a legislative perspective, it's so much easier to address basically trade-offs if you have an accurate understanding of what those trade-offs are. And the only way you can have an accurate understanding of what those trade-offs are is if you develop the evidence around what those trade-offs are going to be for policymakers. So that's what we're working on, and it's a lot of fun. So
great. Well, thank you for that. And I will say, so when you were with Speaker Ryan, they passed the Evidence-Based Policy Act. I think I might have got the title wrong. Created a commission. Once the commission came out with its recommendations, BPC then inherited the commission and continued that great work. And it's really become a foundation of our work here at the organization. So thank you for that. And I know you mentioned child welfare. We're going to touch on that in a little bit. But first, I want to give Patrick the opportunity to talk about his work at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where they're focused on developing humane conservatism and advancing economic policies that serve working families. So Patrick, tell us a little bit more about the mission and your work there.
Yeah, well, the Ethics and Public Policy Center was founded in the mid-70s, really with an eye towards bringing some of the conversations that were happening in the intellectual conservative space around values and what our public policy should be advancing to DC. We're a DC-based think tank, although I live down here in South Carolina. And for the last 4.5 decades, EPPC has been focused on trying to be that bridge between some of these ideas that are happening in the academy and in other think tanks with policymakers. And part of that conversation that's been happening, especially that we've seen pick up steam over the past decade, is thinking about what our economy can do for the most fundamental building block of society, which is the family. And so that's why I joined EPPC after my time on the Hill, thinking about, are there ways that our economic policies are either hindering or advancing the goals of helping families stand on their own 2 feet, being self-sufficient, helping it being more possible to have and raise kids in this economic climate, and also engaging with the culture as well. So we have a broad remit in what that looks like, but overall our focus is trying to think about how economic policy impacts things like family formation and childbearing, and thinking about ways that public policy can ease some of those trade-offs.
Great. So I'm going to dive in a little bit into one of your reports. So the very first 2 sentences of your report on 5 pro-family priorities for the 118th Congress and beyond are: the family is a primary social institution oriented towards the bearing and rearing of children. An agenda to strengthen that institution should protect families and the economic and cultural forces that can undermine them. So this is a pretty powerful framework for thinking about working families. How should policymakers be implementing that? And what are the forces currently undermining the institution of the family?
Yeah, I mean, that could be a day-long seminar to try to unpack all of it. But I think when I look at the way that we talk about families in DC, and sort of from both the left and the right, I think our 2 sort of dominant political parties tend to get some of it right and some of it wrong. My friends, I'm a conservative, my friends on the right for a long time have focused on the sort of family values conversation. And we've seen things like school choice and kids in tech and some of these other issues picking up steam precisely because policymakers and folks on the right are concerned about the cultural pressures that are making it harder for parents to raise kids with the values they want. The sort of media narratives around everything from eating disorders and on down the list that can really harm kids. And so helping give parents more power to stand up to some of those forces, I think really energizes a lot of folks on my side of the aisle. But where we have tended to sometimes fall down is not recognizing that some of the challenges facing parents are not cultural, at least not fundamentally cultural, they're economic as well. And that's something I think my friends across the aisle have tended to do a better job of talking about, recognizing it, especially for working class parents, parents of the middle class or lower income families. Maybe they don't even have time to focus on some of the cultural challenges that energize conservative parents because they're too busy trying to make ends meet. And things like paid leave and childcare and some of these other issues, which traditionally haven't always been on the tip of the tongue when it comes to Republican politicians. As we see the parties reorienting in this sort of post-Trump era that we're in, or post-2016 era that we're in, the Republicans Party becoming a more working class party, a lot of those issues are resonating with working class parents in a way that they wouldn't have maybe 10 or 20 years ago. So I think it's an opportunity for policymakers across both sides of the aisle to borrow a little bit of language from the other and recognize that there's bipartisan compromise to be had. We saw this last week in the bill that Senator Cotton and Senator Schaus from Hawaii introduced on protecting kids online. And this is something that's, again, it may be something that used to be maybe more of a conservative issue, but liberal parents are concerned about it as well. And I think there's opportunities for that kind of bipartisan deal making to be had in this economic policy making as well.
Thank you, Patrick. So there's a lot to dive in there. So Ted, I want to bring you in on this conversation a little bit. So as Patrick mentioned, and I noted, the party does seem to be going through a bit of a transformation away from sort of the party that I knew of limited government and big business. And now it's looking a little, it has this populist side. It's looking more at workers and families. What do you think brought that on? And your thoughts on whether there is how are we going to now find this bipartisan lane for helping strengthen families?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things going on here. One is sort of political and one is more substantive. They're both substantive, I guess. But I think people really looked at sort of post maybe 2010 timeframe. You start seeing a dramatic rise in deaths due to opioids. You start seeing deaths due to alcohol abuse, suicides, all of these sort of what's been categorized as deaths of despair. I think a lot of conservatives are sort of looking at that and thinking to themselves, well, we continue to see sort of strong economic growth, but we're not seeing that translate into sort of strong, we're continuing to see that translate into like really negative outcomes for certain subpopulations in this country. And so I think conservatives now are looking at this and thinking, well, maybe, our top priority shouldn't have been sort of ensuring the estate tax, was as low as possible, right? Maybe our priority should have been on things, around job training or things of that nature. So I think that's a big part of it. I think just people are now looking at sort of a more holistic view as they're analyzing the effects of their policies on families and on people. And then second, I obviously, with the election of Donald Trump, you're starting to see a shift in the Republican coalition, right? So from a more political perspective, the suburbs have trended towards Democrats, sort of higher income individuals have trended that way, whereas lower income Americans have trended towards Republicans. And you're seeing those coalitions sort of adjust as those political trends are happening. And so I think that's going to be important. I mean, you see the new chairman of the Ways and Means Committee really basically saying things like the child tax credit or earned income tax credit are things that he's willing to talk to Democrats on. And I think that's a direct reflection of the fact that he doesn't view us as sort of the party of the suburbs / sort of, higher income individuals. He views us as a working class party. And I think he views that as something that it's important that we address for our constituency. So I think those are the two of the main things happening.
So Ted, you mentioned the child tax credit. Patrick, a lot of your recommendations seem informed by the public sentiment, and you emphasize in your report that the statistic that 60% of parents agreed that people shouldn't have kids if they can't afford to raise them without government assistance. But two of your top priorities are strengthening the child tax credit and creating a federal paid leave benefit. Can you kind of explain that? Because they seem to be in opposition.
Yeah, so the report you're referring to, we based on a poll that we did in conjunction with our friends at the Institute for Family Studies and YouGov, where we polled parents on a slate of different policy proposals that are out there, and one of the most popular ones was the child tax credit, which is good because that's something that I've been championing a lot. So it's hard to see that, but you're right. When you ask people on the question straight up, do you think people should be having kids without government assistance? They say no. So there's always a little bit of tension in public opinion, and how you frame things matters. You think about public schools. If you ask, what is the state of America's schools? People are very likely to say, oh, they're terrible. And then you ask, well, how's your public school doing? And say, oh, it's great. I love it. And so there's always, we see some of things with, members of Congress and different things down the line where the idea of welfare is still sort of stigmatized, and I think is coded as negative, especially for conservative audiences. So when you see plans getting too far into the sort of social engineering, quote unquote, debate, I think that does lose some support on the right. But if you ask people, is it harder to raise a kid today? And does the cost of living make it hard to have kids? You also get really strong numbers in that direction too. I think 85 or something % of parents said, yes, the cost of living makes it hard to have kids these days. So you're kind of caught betwixt and between. You can read that both ways. I think it's a matter of developing policies that are not seen as quote unquote welfare, but as recognizing that parents bear the cost of having kids individually, but the benefits of parenthood and strong families flow to the rest of society. If you're an economist, you would call this a positive social externality. Basically, this idea that society is getting back more through strong families than parents are, because you raise your kid and they go off into the world and they're paying into taxes and Social Security and creating jobs and all that good stuff. So there's a rationale for supporting the family from, I would argue, an economic and certainly political point of view that I think can be done without rolling back the clock on welfare reform of the 1990s, which most Republicans agree was a smashing success. So, some of this is, again, a question of framing and what policies exactly, how you design it. But I think there's a way to kind of split the difference and think about supporting families as broadly as possible without getting caught into the anti-poverty conversation, because I think that's where we kind of get into the weeds and start to lose some folks.
And so there are, as I understand this, there's a couple of different proposals from Republican senators on the Hill around the child tax credit. Can one of you kind of talk a little bit about what those are and what their differences? Patrick,
yeah, sure. I'm happy to do a quick thumbnail sketch. I think for a long time, the sort of clubhouse leaders on the child tax credit space were my old boss, Senator Mike Lee, and Senator Rubio of Florida, who have been proposing increasing the refundability of the child tax credit. And they were actually successful in increasing the amount of the child tax credit in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and they continue to push for expanding that to be more generous for families that don't have federal tax liability. That's really what it boils down to. It's easy to, as a lot of viewers may know, currently you get $2,000 off your federal income taxes for every child you have. But if you don't have that much federal tax liability, then you only a smaller percentage of that. And so the question is, what do we do for those families? Because it's about a third of kids who are growing up in families that don't have the full amount of child tax credit because their parents' earnings are too low. So what do we do with that? So there's a couple different proposals on the table. So Rubio Lee gets at that a little bit. Another proposal that came out was Senator Hawley's proposal, which would sort of stack on top of that and provide a tax credit if you're a parent, sort of blind to the number of kids you have, and just say, I think I have to refresh my memory on the numbers, but I think it was $12,000 for married couples and $6,000 for single parents. Just if you're a parent or not, you get this tax credit. And then the big, game-changing, in my opinion, contribution to the debate was Senator Romney's plan, first introduced in February 2021 and then reintroduced in the summer of last year. He calls it the Family Security Act, which would basically consolidate a bunch of the different tax credits and provisions of the tax code relating to children, from the current child tax credit to the earned income tax credit to the child independent care tax credit, a bunch of different things, and just funnel it all into a simple monthly benefit with a little bit of a phase in at the beginning. So we're encouraging really low income families to have a connection to work. But basically, once you earn more than $10,000 a year, you are eligible for this monthly payment, somewhat similar to what the Biden administration did in the last 6 months of 2021 with their child tax credit expansion. But again, with that connection to work, which is so important for Republicans, I think he was able to get 2 other Republican co-sponsors last time he introduced it. I think it's definitely the most innovative and interesting Republican proposal out there, but we'll see what the appetite is for among Republican Congress if things continue to shake out.
Great, thank you. So you had mentioned this issue of work and incentivizing work, and I think we all know that there is a personal value, the sense of self-worth one gets from being able to work and care for their family financially. And so that's a big part of the Republican side of this. And so there's a lot of talk, if you're looking at the CTC or the SNAP program and other things, about a work requirement. Ted, do you want to talk a little bit about that and where Republicans are coming from and how we do? Just talk a little bit more about conservatives and this need to have a work requirement on some of these programs.
Yeah, I mean, I think work is always going to be sort of a key aspect of Republican policy in this space. You see it with conversations around the SNAP program now, the old food stamp program. You've seen it around the initial version of what Senator Romney proposed on the child tax credit, where he was criticized around sort of the work aspects of it. I think from a conservative perspective, there's a strong belief that if you do not make welfare contingent upon or assistance contingent upon work in some way, then eventually it is long-term harmful to individuals. And I think that's generally true. I think it's been borne out broadly within the literature. I think if you look at welfare reform in '96, I mean, you saw significant reductions in child welfare. You saw people move back into the workforce. If you go back further, there was a bunch of studies done around sort of basic income in the '70s, called the Seattle Income Maintenance Experiment, the Rochester Income Maintenance Experiment. Gary, they did a bunch of these types of things where they were basically trying to experiment with like a negative income tax, sort of an old Milton Friedman idea, to see if that would reduce work at all. And it turned out like these were fairly short-lived programs, not giving a ton of money, and you did see significant work reduction. And so I think where folks are trying to square the circle is you have, on the one hand, a really, really strong support for work for individuals and to require them to work in order to receive assistance. On the other hand, you have a strong, again, a latent, has been fairly latent in Republican policy thought, but is now much, much more sort of in the foretext, but a strong view that at least one parent should be able to stay home if they want to be able to stay home. And so how do you allow for things like that in order to encourage children and in order to strengthen the family? So how do you sort of combine those two issues? And I think Senator Romney did. I think he modified his child tax credit proposal to try to get at that a little bit. But I think that's going to be a key issue for conservatives as they go forward. Like, how do we combine those two priorities?
So I want to dive into this work question a little bit, because as we saw, there were some concerns that, I've seen a couple things that indicate that men in particular have dropped out of the workforce. I know, Patrick, you and I had a little sidebar on this a little bit, and you'd indicated some of the data shows that actually workforce participation is back up. So where are we? I know like COVID kind of threw everything through chaos, the workforce system into chaos. So where are we in terms of workforce participation? And do we need what is there anything Congress needs to do to address that?
Yeah. So if you look at the very short term, sort of since COVID response to the labor market, we've actually gained back pretty much everything we lost. Labor force participation is back to where it was pre-COVID, which is great. to the extent we've seen workers leaving labor force, it's been predominantly workers in their 60s and 70s. And, maybe they have a little more net wealth because their house value went up, or maybe they are just in a better position, or they want to retire early, who knows? But that's not kind of the canonical example of work requirements when you think of. So that the sort of short-term picture looks pretty good. The problem is if you roll the tape back 40, 50 years, we've seen this long, gradual decline in prime age male labor force participation. And it's been counterbalanced by the increase in female labor force participation. So overall, labor force participation among prime age adults looks pretty good. But it's the concern among many on the right is what's happening to these men age 25 to 54 who I think this is where a lot of the conversation around things like industrial policy or, blue collar jobs comes in because, especially in certain areas of the country, Appalachia, the Rust Belt and places like that, you've seen labor force participation for prime age men fall off a cliff, basically. And the concern is, obviously these are long-term trends, but because work and the money that provides ends up being a sort of source of stability for families or could be potential families, what sort of society are we creating? And if we're sort of seeing more and more able-bodied men, Ted mentioned deaths of despair and some of these other things that are, key, and they're inarguably tied up in this conversation. So, while I sort of do think COVID is sort of in our rearview mirror when it comes to the labor force, at least in a lot of ways, the longer term trend and the longer term shift towards more men not participating in institutions of civil society like work, like getting married, like going to church and participating in civic organizations and all that kind of Robert Putnam stuff. That's something that conservatives, I think, especially from these sort of red rural areas, are seeing on a daily basis, and it concerns them. I think that drives a lot of the conversation.
So diving a little bit more into what are some of the obstacles for economic opportunity, and so we've got some workforce issues. There's obviously a huge disparity in education. I had been watching a panel that Speaker Ryan had hosted and talking about education. And I was struck by one statistic that had said there is like a $29,000 annual gap between those who can read by a certain grade and those who can't. And $29,000 a year multiplied over one's lifetime is a huge, huge gap. But when you're looking at education, again, this is one of those issues where Republicans and conservatives have generally not thought there was much of a federal role. We've left it to the state governments. President Bush kind of broke down some of that barrier through No Child Left Behind. But that's a significant gap. In general, there's issues with K through 12 education in general in terms of quality of schools and et cetera. So Ted, where are Republicans now on K through 12 education, and is there a role there for the federal government?
Yeah, I think both parties have really sort of pulled back in terms of the role the federal government could play in K-12. I mean, Democrats are always going to be pro additional resources, but so we did No Child Left Behind was a fairly large expansion of the federal government's role into K-12 education. We rolled a lot of that back in the Every Student Succeeds Act that passed, I think, in 2015. I think folks, just broadly speaking, didn't like the mandates on states. They didn't like sort of neither both the left and the right sort of had strong concerns with the federal government sort of imposing its will on states. And you saw that a little bit too when President Obama, he did push the Race to the Top initiative, trying to provide $4 to $5 billion, I think, to states that adopted Common Core and a couple other reforms. But the school reform movement, broadly speaking, has lost a lot of sort of steam at the federal level. At the state level, Republicans are very, very much in favor of school choice, and they've been really going full speed ahead on those issues at the state level. And I think you'll continue to see that. And I think that's where all the energy in the conservative movement is on these issues. So I honestly, I don't see, it's somewhat of a shame in the sense that K-12 is such an important part of the problem. But I don't see any energy on the Republican side to really go after making those reforms outside of, we passed the parental Bill of Rights at the very beginning of this Congress to again allow parents more sort of say in how their schools are being run. So
they are interested in helping with things like the child care tax credit. And we've seen some movement. BPC has started working with a group in the House around paid leave. So they are doing things along those lines to help families and address, particularly around the childcare, early education needs. And I wanted to talk a little bit more with you, Ted, because one of the projects that you are working with our team on is launching a project around child welfare. It's I worked on these issues 20 some odd years ago with Congresswoman Nancy Johnson at the time, and it's sad we haven't made too much more progress on these issues in terms of helping children who are in the foster care system, helping them age out, and how we address some of that. So can you talk a little bit more about what you're working on with my colleagues?
yeah, so at the foundation too, we made sort of a key goal or a key issue is improving child welfare. In large part, when I was on the Hill, when the speaker was on the Hill, we passed sort of a landmark reform bill for what's called the Title IV-E program, which is sort of the main funding source for child welfare programs. It's called the Families First Act. And so what that was trying to do was, again, sort of use evidence to help prevent kids from having to enter into the foster care system in the first place. The concern, when you were working on it, when I was working on it, broadly speaking, these have always been pretty bipartisan issues. Not in the sense that there's always been the fights around funding levels, like there's always going to be those types of fights. But I think there's been a broad agreement that both this is an extraordinarily vulnerable population that needs help, and second, that this is a population that deserves federal support, right? This isn't just a state issue. Like these are kids that through no fault of their own find themselves in a really, really difficult situation. And so there's been a number of pieces of legislation over the years that have sort of tried to take pieces of this, again, culminating in Families First, but a lot of different pieces that have always been bipartisan and that people have supported. And so one of the things that we're looking at right now, especially with BPC, is that still the case, right? Are people's values sort of shifting away from being in a place where that we can now have, where it's going to be much harder to get to bipartisan solutions in the future. So you can see things around sort of LGBT issues. You can see things around sort of racial issues in terms of like, white parents adopting African-American children. There's a lot of sort of difficult issues where people are engaging on and there's now sort of a much larger difference of opinion, I think, on some of these issues than previously there might have been. And so I think folks are really trying to understand that and to figure out, okay, are there ways that we can still make sure no matter what's happening on some of these more controversial issues, are there still things that we can do to make sure we're protecting children, to make sure that we're making sure that children are safe, and to the extent possible, to making sure that children can stay with their families?
Well, that's hopefully, I would hope that we can figure out a path forward on some of the more controversial things, because you're right, those children really, through no fault of their own, are in a really tough spot. And I do think as a country, and the federal government does have a role to play there. So I'm excited. If those of you who are interested in the issue, just keep an eye on BPC, because we're launching some work in that space. I want to touch base a little bit more on the paid leave and childcare issues. So way too many kids are coming into kindergarten completely unprepared for school. And unfortunately, that does have economic and racial disparities associated with it. So Patrick, you wrote about expanding the credit to employers who provide childcare and even allowing them to pool resources for the credit. Do you have views on that? Have targeted so some Republicans have targeted the child care and dependent care tax credit as a pay for expansion of the CTC. Do you have thoughts on whether that's the right mechanism or how that would help working families?
Yeah, there's a couple different issues there, but
yep.
For the CTC, the Child Independent Care Tax Credit, I actually do support kind of folding that into a broader child tax credit, and a couple of reasons why. One is because the current CDCTC is very regressive distributionally. It benefits a lot of parents who have formal childcare expenses and have both parents in the labor force, or I should say all parents in the labor force. So there are a number of low-income single parents who do benefit from it, but the bulk of the benefits flow to higher upper-income couples. And we know from research from Luke Rogers at Florida State University and a couple other people that a lot of that gets passed through in the form of higher prices, similar to in higher education, where if you expand federal assistance, you see college tuition increase, and you say, I wonder if there's any pass through there. You can see when the CDCTC expands, providers respond by recognizing, okay, parents have a little more in their pocket. And so about 50 to 60 cents on the dollar gets passed through in the form of higher prices. So I think individual side childcare expenditures through the tax code isn't my preferred way to do it. And there's another reason for that as well, is it's maybe a more philosophical concern. When you look at the decisions for families, Ted mentioned this earlier, I think there's a renewed emphasis on the right about parents who have two parent household, and they want to have one parent stay home. If you are two parents in the workforce and you have tax credits or tax provisions related to your childcare expenses, it's in effect a slight federal subsidy towards that dual earner model. And parents who want to have a parent stay home with the young children aren't able to take advantage of that credit. And so Republicans generally, and we saw this in the debate over Build Back Better, see that as sort of putting a thumb on the scale towards an economic model that encourages two parents in the workforce rather than a single earner. So I think, again, when you're looking at the individual side of things, I'm much more skeptical. But I do think when we talk about employer incentives and some of the provisions you talked about, even providing direct grants to childcare facilities, I actually kind of liked what the Biden administration was trying to do in terms of giving grants to smaller childcare providers who want to expand or build up their capacity. That kind of thing, I think, can help the market for childcare work a little more efficiently. And then if we're able to expand the child tax credit, which goes to all parents, or all parents with a worker, that allows them to make the choice when it comes to childcare and early childhood that's right for them, without having to have formal childcare expenses, when a lot of parents prefer to have a relative or a neighbor or home-based childcare or something like that. So I tend to favor those type of solutions over things that are in the individual side of the tax code.
Okay, I should point out that we do have a very robust project area around early childhood education, and they're very big supporters of the child independent care tax credit. So clearly a lot of discussion to be had about how we resolve those differences. But importantly, I think everyone is having a conversation about how we support parents and young children and how to give everybody the best leg up that we can. But that does raise some questions too about the role of the tax code here. Is the goal of a tax code that is neutral with respect to family structure and child rearing, or is the goal a tax code that provides clear incentives for certain choices? Anyone want to weigh in on that one?
Really depends on who you ask there. I think you're going to find, I think this is probably somewhat at the heart of the split that you're starting to see sort of between a more pro-populist Republican Party and sort of a more doctrinaire free market Republican Party, right? I mean, a Senator Lee, a Senator Romney, a Senator Rubio, I think they would answer that question very, very differently than, a former Senator Portman or, whomever it is. I think this is exactly what folks are trying to work through. And I think this is where a lot of the energy in the Republican Party is going to be, in terms of how do you ensure clear incentives? Because we all want to continue to have material prosperity. We don't want to be harming economic growth, but how do you sort of maintain those clear incentives while also promoting, I think, also something that's really vital to sort of the well-being of the country and the well-being of people, as much so as economic growth, which is sort of strong families and the ability for people to have, to maintain those strong families. So I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation. I think there's probably a minority of the Republican Party that's very much in favor of a tax code that's going to put a finger on the scale of sort of more pro-family. I think it's still the party as a majority that's at least in power at the moment, and is elected at the moment, is more on the free market side. But I think that's going to be shifting as younger politicians get into office. I think folks are much more comfortable with using the tax code as a sort of incentive for specific policy goals. And it's just sort of a reflection again of a Republican Party and some certain members of that party that are much more comfortable with the use of government sort of power to achieve policy aims.
I'll just tag in there to say that we saw with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that I mentioned earlier, Senator Rubio really went to the mat to try to have the CTC included, and he sort of achieved a partial victory there. And I think when you look at 2025, when that expansion is scheduled to expire, it's going to be a really interesting testing point to see how the party has changed over the last 8 years, and whether Republicans who have started to talk about being a pro-worker, pro-family party, whether they're willing to put their money where their mouth is and use that expiration as a chance to interrogate the sort of the assumptions behind some of these tax provisions that we're talking about, or to maintain the status quo, or maybe there's a possibility that things blow up and we revert back to pre-2017 levels. I don't think that's the case, but I agree with Ted that there is a split, and it is largely, I think, somewhat, at least along generational lines. I mentioned Senator Hawley's proposal earlier, which would create an explicit benefit for married couples in relation to single parents, and those type of policies. I think you're going to start to see more and more coming from the, as Ted says, a sort of more populist wing, and they'll face opposition from the more mainstream folks, types in the party. And the interesting question is going to be, how that debate happens across the aisle as well. Because if we're talking about, well, let's expand benefits for families, but we're only going to do so in ways that sort of advance a normative vision of what families should look like, does that poison the well for bipartisan conversation, or are there areas we can maneuver and see if there are areas of overlapping interest, even if it means giving a little here or there?
What I find interesting, though, is if the House Republicans have to go into negotiations with, say, the Senate Democrats and the administration on some of these issues, that and certainly the Democratic Party is not united in their beliefs on a number of issues. They're equally divisive issues on their side, but it's questioning like which Republican Party is going to enter the conference committee negotiations, and what is really where are the points where they can come to agreement, not just within the party, but also with the other side on some of these issues. It'd be interesting to watch. Ted?
I think that actually makes it slightly easier for proponents of like an expanded CTC and things of that nature, because the trade-off in that case is very, very simple, like maintain the lower corporate tax rate and we're going to expand the CTC, right? You just sort of maintain the structure of TCJA, and in return, Democrats sort of basically get a larger child tax credit and larger EITC, maybe something like that. Like it seems to me that the trade-offs in that situation are much easier. I mean, of course, the deficit is what suffers. People will just, we'll just end up there, which is normally where we end up. So, but yeah, I think that makes the trades pretty easy. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, we do have an event coming up on May 11th with some other BPC fellows, Jim Capretta and Warren Payne, where we will get into issues around the federal deficit and budget negotiations. So stay tuned for those. Just a reminder to viewers that you can put questions in the chat or on Twitter at BPC_live. So I've mentioned it a couple of times, but we haven't really gotten into this issue around paid leave, and then I'm going to turn to audience questions. We do have, as I mentioned, have a working group we're supporting in the House with Chrissy Houlihan and Stephanie Bice. So Patrick, but one of your pro-family priorities for the Congress is federal paid leave. Talk a little bit more about that, because that again seems to pivot away from where the party had been in the past.
Yeah. It's something that, again, when we polled parents, that was something that was off the charts, and the amount of support it gets across the aisle. Pew's found the same thing. Gallup. It polls really well in the abstract. The question is, once you start getting down into the nitty gritty, who's going to pay for it? How is it going to be structured? Then you start to see kind of the predictable lines start to fall out. And so I think anything that's an employer side mandate is pretty much a non-starter for Republicans. You could I a fan of some of these proposals that would provide credits and that sort of thing to employers who want to do the right thing for their employees. But certainly when you're talking about small businesses or nonprofits, they're just never going to have the resources available to basically pay an employee to be out for 6 to 8 weeks following the birth of a child, and then find somebody to fill that spot. I mean, that's just sort of an unavoidable challenge for a lot of small businesses, and those are the workers who tend not to have access to paid leave. So if we're concerned about that, I'm much more open than I used to be to the idea of doing something at the federal level, recognizing that if there's a way to do it that could be fiscally sustainable, that would be ideal. But I think that's a conversation that's still figuring out. I mean, we see this in some of the blue states as well, where a lot of the plans that they've rolled out have work requirements and earnings history requirements that actually mean that between 30 and 50% of new parents are ineligible for the paid leave program, just because of the way they've structured it, and it tends to favor a sort of economic model that encourages people to delay having children until they're sort of financially stable and have had a promotion and are in their mid-30s and that sort of thing, which may be good or bad. We can have that debate, but it is a policy choice that a lot of these blue states have made, rather than doing something more universal that would provide more benefits to lower income, maybe service industry workers, for example, who don't have the sort of stable history of wages. And so, these are not value neutral debates. These are questions about what sort of society we want to be creating and what sort of, how that should be instantiated in public policy. And I am, generally of the idea, and I think we see this borne out of the polling, that Republicans are strongest in favor of paid leave when it comes to having a baby, and especially moms, because moms obviously go through the physical process of giving birth that dads don't have to, and there's just a longer recovery associated with that. Once you start expanding the circle out and out and out to caring for a sick relative or personal time off for paid leave and that sort of thing, you see a noticeable decline in the support of Republicans for paid leave. So I think focusing on paid parental leave specifically is probably the one that gets the most support across the aisle. And again, it's this question of how you structure it, and can you do it in a way that that's not going to impact businesses. I think those are the big questions that hopefully your team will be helping negotiate through Congress.
Well, I do wonder too, I understand your emphasis on parental leave, and I think that's probably right with the polling. But as we see more of this, to your point earlier about the generational divide, as we get more and more of us into this sandwich generation where we're having to deal and help elderly parents, does the polling change any for broadening that? Or is it more that that's not an issue that the federal government should address, but it's just one of those interesting points maybe to look at again in a few years, as more of us have to deal with aging parents as well as young children.
Yeah, agreed.
So I'm going to turn now to a couple questions that we got online. There's a question from David Plaster. With 4 kids, you need to earn $46,000 to get the full CTC. What kind of income phase-in would you advocate for that would give the credit to the more of the 19 million kids who still don't get the full CTC? Do you want to take that one, Patrick?
Sure. Well, I'm a fan of Senator Romney's approach that they rolled out in the second iteration of his Family Security Act. And basically what it says is anybody who makes more than $10,000 a year is eligible for the full amount of credit. So in this case, it would be, for 4 kids, you'd be getting whatever that is, 36 times 4. I guess it depends on the ages of the kids. But regardless, once you hit that threshold, you're in, and you've sort of paid into the system, and you're able to get the full measure of the credit back. For people who are making less than that, you have it scaled down by, if you're making $5,000 a year, then your CTC is scaled down by half, for example. In some respects, people say, well, aren't those the least the fortunate and the lowest income people. But you have to remember that this is a family strengthening program. It's not an anti-poverty program, and there's still the sort of sphere of TANF and SNAP and all those things that are aimed specifically at a population in deep poverty that could be improved, and we can have that debate with the research that Ted and his group are doing about better ways to do welfare. But that's a different conversation. Those are intractable generational problems for people who are in really deep poverty, and I see that as a conversation that is only going to muddy the waters. And we've talked about the importance for work, and so trying to build in that incentive to say, if you can just demonstrate that you're paying into the system, you have some skin in the game, we'll make sure that you're getting the full amount of the child tax credit. I like that approach. I think it's a really smart one. Yet again, we'll see what sort of the majority of the Republican caucus has to say if it ever has a chance of passing.
Okay, we have two more here. So school choice is just code to end public education. In small rural areas, parents do not have a choice in schools. In urban areas, it would devastate already underfunded schools. The question is whether that is a pro-family policy. Either one of you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of different opinions on school choice, obviously, in terms of is it effective or not. In terms of being pro-family, I don't think it's pro or anti-family. I don't think folks that are looking to move school choice bills in the states are doing them specifically because they're pro-family. I think they're doing it because they think it's the best thing for the children and to try to improve schools for those children. So there's a family aspect to that, but it's much more focused on the children rather than strengthening the family, is what I would say.
Patrick?
Can I put a little different spin? I think the questioner is right that certainly in small town Texas, there's actually a lot of resistance to school choice programs because they're concerned about the traditional public schools, the sort of locus of community and Friday night lights and all that sort of stuff. So it is a dynamic that you see, but for the most part, I think the shift that we've seen on school choice in the sort of quiet revolution that's been happening in a lot of states is because proponents have successfully pitched it as a pro-family measure. And by that, I mean, not necessarily the economic stability of the family, although certainly, if low-income parents are struggling to make ends meet to pay for private school tuition, this is going to be a huge benefit to them. But more thinking about it holistically and thinking about the burdens that parents face, sort of the stories you see online of parents finding out their kids are reading certain books or being exposed to different curricula, and tapping into the anxiety that parents feel about the sort of the moral formation of their children. And so in that sense, I do think school choice has been reconstituted as, rather than a vehicle for sort of improving test scores for any sort of kids, which was sort of the grand bipartisan compromise of vouchers and charter schools in the mid 2000s. It's now been really put in the vein of giving parents more choice over how their kid is educated, and certainly a lot of the stuff that came out of COVID and critical race theory conversations and all that kind of stuff really poured fuel on the fire. So that's how I think school choice is really becoming part of the conversation. Now, again, how you see it is going to differ across the aisle, but I think the success of school choice has been in large part because they're tapping into this idea of wanting to be pro-family.
So thank you both. So we've got one more. David, hold on a second. Oh, Victor Reclatus. I'm sorry, I probably just butchered that. What child care policies have the best chance of becoming a reality right now with a Republican House, a Democratic Senate? Something on the CTC?
So I don't think you're going to see a whole lot of movement on the CTC in the near future. I think, frankly, you're not going to see a lot of policy making in this space in the near future. I think you see a lot of energy as people try to develop policies. I would point to sort of smaller things. So there's the CCDBG, right, which could see an increase in funding. There's all sorts of like smaller, more targeted things that folks can sort of work on. several years back, the Trump administration expanded paid family leave to all federal employees, right? Again, a much more targeted sort of proposal that could get bipartisan support and you can move. I think if you're going to see a large shift to like the CTC or something like that, the most likely opportunity is going to be during the sort of Tax Cuts and Jobs Act 2025 reauthorization, or whatever they're going to do for that to extend it or not.
Yep. I agree with Ted on the big picture. I don't really see much happening in the next 2 years on some of the big topics. There are some of the smaller things that you could see. One that I think doesn't get enough attention, and actually BPC has a great report out it looked at how this is working, is Section 45F of the IRS is employer provided childcare, and making that more generous and more available to more employees that want to provide childcare on site. Benefits parents because you're able to have your little one right nearby for lunch dates and all that sort of stuff, and helps employers kind of compete for workers in a tight labor market. And it's just a pure credit to employers. You're not touching some of these other naughtier conversations. So it's already parents who are already working. So the sort of philosophical questions don't come to play. I think something like that probably could move. You see some conversations around it. Also, Richard Burr, who just retired, and Tim Scott of South Carolina introduced a child care block grant reauthorization bill that would have kind of changed some of the language and greatly expanded eligibility. I frankly would have seen that having a very hard time to get much Republican support, but it was a starting point for conversation, and we'll see as that goes along. And certainly as Tim Scott tries to increase his national profile and whatnot, maybe that will become part of the conversation, and maybe there'll be room for some bipartisan conversations on that piece.
That would be great. One final question here from David Plaster on work. Have either of the panelists looked at a more recent studies from guaranteed income pilots showing increases in full-time employment and the effects of the 2021 CTC showing no effect on work? Are you all familiar with the study?
Yeah, I don't know, Patrick, if you want to give your take on it, but.
My take is it's hard to extrapolate from short-term programs to long-term outcomes, and a lot of people point to the 2021 CDC expansion and say, look, it didn't do anything to work, and I agree with that. It doesn't seem to have done anything. We saw labor force participation continue to go up, but it was also at a time where we had a severe labor shortage, and again, the sort of weird post-COVID environment that we're in. So I hesitate to extrapolate too much from that, other than to say macroeconomic policy is really important when we're talking about the labor market. In some respects, I almost want to take a step back and say that's almost a second order concern to me. I'm willing to take the trade-off of a couple 100,000 low-income parents dropping out of the labor force if their families are more stable. But again, it's that long-term concern, and I do think some of the programs that get thrown around are probably so generous that you would start to see those numbers piling up really quickly, where you could talk about 1 million or 2 million low-income families having no connection to work at all if you were to expand the Biden administration's expanded CDC. And so that's where I start to be a little concerned and say, okay, there is such thing as too much of a good thing, and we have to figure out ways that we can support families in a way that's fiscally responsible, and also recognizing that just handing someone a check isn't the end of the story. That building those habits of self-sufficiency and independence and modeling the virtues of hard work to your kids, I think that needs to be part of the conversation as well. It's not just a financial situation.
Great. Well, with that, I want to thank both of our panelists, Patrick and Ted. Thanks so much for coming on and having a really interesting conversation. I'm actually hopeful that there are I know the politics of the Congress at the moment make it challenging to see significant legislation occur, but maybe there's some small things that can help advance some of this. And I do want to call our viewers' attention to, again, we have another follow-up event on May 11th. And then on June 28th, we are talking with Rick Dearborn. And then on July 12th, we will be talking to former Senator Trent Lott, again, looking at how conservatives can advance their agenda in a divided government. So thank you all for participating today. Thank you again to Patrick and Ted.
Thanks so much.